His story is still told in hushed voices across North Carolina. Lazarus, an enslaved man who devised a revenge so meticulously calculated that 9 plantation supervisors burned alive in a single night. 9 men, 1 fire, 0 survivors. This was not a crime of passion, not a spontaneous act of rage. This was methodical, deliberate, executed with the precision of a master craftsman who understood exactly how to turn the very industry that enslaved him into an instrument of death. But what drives a man to such calculated vengeance? What did those 9 supervisors do to Lazarus that made burning them alive the only acceptable justice? And how does one powerless enslaved man, with no weapons and no freedom, plan and execute the perfect murder of 9 white men without leaving a shred of evidence? Before we uncover how Lazarus transformed turpentine and fire into retribution, I need you to do something. If stories of calculated revenge fascinate you, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop in the comments, where are you listening from? Your state? Your city? Now let's discover what happened in the pine forests of Cumberland County in 1856, and how 1 man's loss became 9 men's death sentence. The pine forests of southeastern North Carolina stretched for hundreds of miles in 1856, an ocean of longleaf pine that had made the region the turpentine capital of America. Cumberland County, where our story unfolds, produced more naval stores, turpentine, tar, and rosin than any other county in the nation. The industry was brutal, back-breaking work that relied almost entirely on enslaved labor. Unlike cotton or tobacco plantations where enslaved people might work in proximity to the main house, the turpentine camps existed deep in the forests, sometimes 20 or 30 miles from civilization, creating isolated kingdoms where overseers wielded absolute power. The process of extracting turpentine was dangerous and exhausting. Enslaved workers, called turpentine hands, would make deep diagonal cuts in the pine trees, creating a V-shaped wound called a box near the base of the trunk. The resin would slowly seep down into these boxes, where it collected until workers could scoop it out with long-handled dippers. The cuts had to be renewed every few days, climbing higher and higher up the tree throughout the season. A single worker might be responsible for thousands of trees, walking miles each day through snake-infested underbrush, breathing the thick, sweet stench of pine resin that coated their lungs and skin. But the real money in turpentine wasn't made by those who did the work, or even by the plantation owners who profited from it. In Cumberland County, a system had evolved, a shadow economy that existed in the margins of the official business. This is where our story truly begins. Lazarus belonged to a man named Cyrus Hartwell, who owned a medium-sized plantation along the Cape Fear River. Hartwell, like many owners in the region, had discovered that leasing out enslaved workers to the turpentine industry was more profitable than farming. He could rent out a man like Lazarus for $8 to $10 a month, paid directly to him, while the turpentine operation fed and housed the worker. It was a system that created a peculiar dynamic. Enslaved people who rarely saw their legal owners, controlled instead by white overseers and supervisors who operated with almost no oversight in the remote forest camps. Lazarus was 32 years old in 1856, though no one knew his exact age, not even himself. He had been born on the Hartwell plantation, the son of a woman named Ruth who had died when he was 7. He had grown up knowing nothing but the turpentine forests, first as a child helping to collect resin, then as a full worker by the time he was 12. By his early 30s, he was what they called a premier hand, someone who could handle the most trees, who knew the forest better than anyone, who could judge by looking at a cut whether it would yield good resin or run dry. He was a quiet man, tall and lean from years of physical labor, with hands permanently stained amber from the sticky resin that never quite washed away. Those who remembered him later would speak of his eyes, dark and watchful, always observing, always calculating. He had taught himself to read, stealing moments with discarded newspapers when he could find them, puzzling out words by firelight in the workers' cabins. This skill, which he kept hidden from his overseers, would later prove crucial to his plan. The turpentine operation where Lazarus worked was managed by a man named Vernon Ketchum. But the real power lay with 9 supervisors who controlled different sections of the vast forest operation. These men were not plantation owners themselves. They were overseers, poor whites who had clawed their way up from poverty to positions of authority over enslaved workers. Their names would later be recorded in the official death records: Samuel Pruitt, Jedediah Stokes, Nathaniel Boggs, Elias Crenshaw, Hosea Talbot, Abner Liddell, Silas Farrow, Beauregard Vinson, and Thomas Garraway. Each supervised between 20 and 40 enslaved workers in different sections of the pine forest, and each had developed his own reputation for cruelty. Pruitt was known for his whip, which he wore coiled at his belt like a snake. Stokes preferred psychological torture, threatening to sell workers' children if they didn't meet quotas. Boggs had a system of fines for imagined infractions, though the enslaved workers never saw any wages from which these fines could be deducted. The punishments were instead extracted in additional labor, food reductions, or physical abuse. What no one knew, not Vernon Ketchum, not the plantation owners who leased out their human property, not even the other white workers in the turpentine operation, was that these 9 supervisors had created their own private enterprise within the larger business. It began, as many stories of injustice do, with a woman. Her name was Dinah, and she had been Lazarus's wife for 3 years. They had married in the way enslaved people could marry, without legal recognition, without ceremony, but with a bond as real as any blessed by church or state. Dinah worked in the cooking shack that served the turpentine workers, preparing the meager rations of cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses that constituted their daily meals. She was 26, with a quick laugh that could lighten even the darkest days in the forest camps, and she was 6 months pregnant with their first child. On a Thursday evening in March of 1855, more than a year before the fire, Lazarus returned to the workers' compound to find Dinah missing from the cooking shack. The other women there wouldn't meet his eyes. Finally, an older woman named Hattie pulled him aside and whispered that Silas Farrow had taken Dinah to his cabin an hour before sunset. The supervisors' cabins were off-limits to the enslaved workers, a cluster of rough-hewn structures about a quarter-mile from the workers' quarters. Lazarus approached Farrow's cabin as the last light was fading from the sky, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear voices inside, Dinah's voice high and frightened, and Farrow's drunken laughter. What happened next was later disputed in the whispered accounts that circulated through the enslaved community. Some said Lazarus kicked in the door, others said he tried the handle and found it unlocked. But everyone agreed on what he saw. Dinah pressed against the wall, her dress torn, and Farrow advancing toward her with his belt undone. Lazarus crossed the room in 3 strides and struck Farrow across the face. The supervisor, drunk and caught off balance, fell hard against his own table, which splintered beneath his weight. For a moment, the only sound was Farrow's ragged breathing and the distant chirping of evening crickets. Then Farrow stood up, blood streaming from his nose, and smiled. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, boy," he said quietly. Lazarus took Dinah's hand and pulled her from the cabin. They ran through the darkening forest, knowing that running solved nothing, that there was nowhere to go, but driven by pure instinct to escape. They made it as far as their own cabin before 6 white men caught up with them, Farrow among them, his face swollen and dark with rage. What followed was meant as a lesson to the entire workforce. The 9 supervisors, all of them, gathered the enslaved workers into a clearing lit by torches. Lazarus was tied to a whipping post that had been erected for just such occasions, and Samuel Pruitt, with his famous whip, delivered 40 lashes while the others watched. But that wasn't the worst of it. When Lazarus was cut down, barely conscious, Jedediah Stokes stepped forward with the announcement. "This one's shown himself to be uppity," Stokes declared, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Too dangerous to keep here. Mr. Hartwell will be notified that we're selling him south come morning. And his woman, too." Dinah screamed. Being sold south meant the sugar and cotton plantations of the Deep South, where enslaved people were literally worked to death, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. And pregnant as she was, the journey alone might kill her. But Abner Lydell, the youngest of the supervisors, held up his hand. "Now, hold on," he said, a cruel smile playing at his lips. "I got a better idea. Vernon's been wanting to expand the operation west, toward the Lumber River. That's hard country, not many workers want to go there. What say we keep the woman here, let her work off his debt? She can cook, can't she? We need cooks, but this one," he jerked his thumb at Lazarus, "he goes west, alone. That way, he knows his woman and his child are here, depending on his good behavior. He steps out of line even once, she pays for it." The 9 supervisors conferred briefly, then nodded. It was agreed. Lazarus would be separated from Dinah, but not sold. He would work the most remote, most dangerous section of the turpentine operation, 40 miles west, in the swampy bottomlands near the Lumber River, where the trees grew in standing water and cottonmouth snakes dropped from branches overhead. And if he caused any trouble, if he failed to meet his quota, if he showed even a hint of defiance, word would be sent back, and Dinah would be punished. As the crowd was dismissed and Lazarus was being dragged to a wagon for transport, Thomas Garraway leaned close to his ear and whispered, "You should have just let Silas have his fun. Would have been over in 5 minutes. Now you get to spend the rest of your life wondering if she's safe, wondering if your baby will ever know its father. Was it worth it, boy?" Lazarus said nothing. His back was on fire, his wrists bloody from the ropes, but his eyes were clear as he looked at each of the 9 men in turn. He was memorizing their faces, though he didn't yet know why. The wagon carried him west that very night, and he didn't see Dinah again for 3 weeks. When he finally was allowed a brief visit, accompanied by 2 armed guards, he found her thinner, her eyes hollow with fear and exhaustion. She told him, speaking quickly in the few minutes they had, that she'd been forced to work 16-hour days in the cooking shack, that the supervisors had cut the rations for all the women as collective punishment, that Silas Farrow walked past her several times a day just to remind her he could take whatever he wanted whenever he chose. "But the baby?" Lazarus asked, his hand trembling as it hovered over her swollen belly. "Still strong," she whispered. "Still kicking. It knows its daddy is fighting for us." That was the last time he spoke to her alive. In the swamplands near the Lumber River, Lazarus worked in conditions that would have broken most men. The operation there was smaller, more primitive, with only about 15 enslaved workers and 2 white overseers. The pines grew differently here, twisted and stunted by the wet soil, yielding less resin and requiring more cuts to produce the same amount. The water that pooled around the bases of the trees was often knee-deep, breeding grounds for mosquitoes and snakes. Workers developed fevers, infections, mysterious ailments that left them too weak to meet their quotas. But Lazarus learned things in that swamp that would later prove invaluable. He learned that turpentine vapors, which were always present in the forest air, became especially concentrated in enclosed spaces. He learned that these vapors were heavier than air, settling in low places, invisible and odorless until someone brought a flame near them. He had seen a storage shed explode one afternoon when an overseer lit his pipe too close to an open barrel. The flash of ignition, the roar of flames consuming everything in seconds, the man's screams cut short by the inferno. He learned that the resin itself, once heated, became a fuel that water could not extinguish. He watched as workers tried to put out a small fire in a collection vat, only to see the water spread the burning resin across the ground like liquid hellfire. And he learned that the smoke from burning pine resin was thick and black, choking, capable of suffocating a man before the flames ever touched him. These observations, catalogued silently in his mind, seemed like random pieces of a puzzle he didn't yet know he was assembling. 3 months into his exile in the swamps, a new worker arrived. A young man named Isaiah, who had been transferred from the main operation. Isaiah brought news from the camp where Dinah worked. and the news was devastating. Dinah had lost the baby. Isaiah, speaking in whispers during the brief evening hours when the workers were left unsupervised, explained what had happened. Dinah had been forced to lift a heavy iron pot of boiling water despite her advanced pregnancy. She had pleaded with the supervisor on duty, Hosea Talbot, that the pot was too heavy, that she needed help. Talbot had responded by threatening to withhold her rations if she didn't do as she was told. She had lifted the pot, felt something tear inside her, and collapsed. The baby, a boy, was stillborn 2 days later. They didn't even let her rest, Isaiah said, his voice breaking. Had her back in the cooking shack 3 days after. Said she was faking her grief to get out of work. Lazarus received this news in silence. He was standing knee-deep in swamp water, the evening sun turning the sky orange through the pine branches overhead. Something changed in him in that moment, not a breaking but a hardening, a transformation of grief into something colder and more purposeful. He asked Isaiah one question. The 9 supervisors who run the main operation, do they still meet regular? Isaiah nodded. First Friday of every month they all gather at old Pharaoh's cabin. Poker game, they say. Sometimes they're there till near dawn. Lazarus said nothing more about it, but he began to plan. Over the following months, Lazarus became a model worker. He exceeded his quotas, never complained, showed nothing but deference to the overseers in the swamp. His exemplary behavior earned him small privileges, an extra biscuit with dinner, permission to stay up an hour later than the other workers to mend his tools. He used these moments of relative freedom to continue his secret education, finding old newspapers that the overseers had discarded, studying not just the words, but the way white men conducted their business, the language they used, the methods they employed. In November of 1855, 8 months after losing his son, Lazarus was transferred back to the main operation. The official reason was that he had proven himself rehabilitated, that his good behavior had earned him a return to less harsh conditions. But Lazarus knew the real reason. They were short-handed at the main camp, and bodies were needed for the winter tapping season. When he arrived back at the compound, he learned that Dinah was gone. She had been sold, actually sold this time, to a plantation owner in South Carolina 3 weeks earlier. No one knew exactly where. The supervisors had decided she was too melancholy, too slow in her work since losing the child. They had sold her for $75 and pocketed the money themselves, telling Cyrus Hartwell that she had run away. This was the final piece of information Lazarus needed. The 9 supervisors weren't just cruel, they were thieves, stealing from the very plantation owners they served. And if they were bold enough to sell an enslaved person and pocket the proceeds, what other schemes might they be running? Lazarus began to watch and listen with renewed purpose. The turpentine operation, Lazarus gradually discovered, was a masterwork of systematic theft. The 9 supervisors had spent years perfecting their scheme, and it was brilliantly simple. They were responsible for measuring and recording the amount of turpentine, tar, and rosin produced by their respective sections of the forest. These measurements were supposed to be reported accurately to Vernon Ketchum, who in turn reported to the plantation owners, but the supervisors had developed a system of false accounting that skimmed profits at every level. Lazarus pieced this together through careful observation and by taking enormous risks. He learned to read the ledgers that the supervisors kept, stealing moments when a book was left unattended, memorizing numbers and comparing them to the actual production he witnessed. He discovered that the supervisors underreported production by about 15%. Not enough to raise immediate suspicion, but enough to accumulate significant quantities of unreported naval stores over time. These unreported barrels of turpentine, tar, and rosin were hidden in various locations throughout the forest, stored in abandoned shacks or buried in waterproof containers. Once every few months a wagon would arrive at night, and these hidden stores would be loaded and transported away, sold to buyers in Wilmington or Fayetteville who asked no questions about provenance. The money was split among the 9 supervisors, each receiving an equal share of what amounted to hundreds of dollars per year, a fortune for men of their station. But Lazarus discovered something even more valuable than the theft itself. He found where they kept their records. Silas Farrow, the same man who had assaulted Dinah, served as the group's bookkeeper. In his cabin, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, was a ledger that detailed every transaction, every theft, every dollar divided among the 9 conspirators. The ledger went back 7 years, a complete record of their criminal enterprise. Lazarus saw this ledger only once, during a brief moment when Farrow had left his cabin unlocked while drunk. Lazarus had slipped in, found the hiding spot, memorized as much as he could, and left without disturbing anything. That ledger, Lazarus realized, was both the supervisor's insurance policy and their greatest vulnerability. They kept it as protection against each other, proof of shared guilt that prevented any one of them from betraying the others. But it was also evidence that could destroy them all if it fell into the right hands, or the wrong ones. Lazarus understood that simply revealing the theft wouldn't bring him justice. The word of an enslaved man against 9 white supervisors would mean nothing in any court, legal or otherwise. Even if plantation owners believed him, the supervisors would likely face fines or dismissal at worst, and Lazarus would be sold or killed for his trouble. Revenge, if it was to come, needed to be absolute and untraceable. He began to formulate his plan in January of 1856. The monthly meetings of the 9 supervisors followed a predictable pattern. They gathered at Silas Farrow's cabin on the first Friday of each month, ostensibly to play cards and drink. Farrow's cabin was the largest and most isolated, situated nearly a mile from the nearest worker quarters, surrounded by dense pine forest on all sides. The meetings typically lasted from sundown until well past midnight, sometimes until dawn. During these gatherings, they would divide their illicit profits, plan the next month's thefts, and celebrate their success with corn whiskey that Hosea Talbot brought from his brother's still. Lazarus learned these details through careful observation and by cultivating sources among the other enslaved workers. An older man named Silas, different from Supervisor Farrow, worked as a kind of servant to the supervisors, bringing them firewood, cleaning their cabins, tasks that gave him access to their spaces and their conversations. Silas trusted Lazarus, had known him since he was a boy, and shared what he observed without fully understanding why Lazarus was so interested. "They get awful drunk at those meetings," Silas mentioned one evening. "Last month, 3 of them passed out right there in Farrow's cabin, didn't stumble home till near sunrise, and they always lock the door from the inside. Don't want nobody disturbing their card game, they say. Got all the windows shuttered up tight too. Keep the light from showing through the forest. Locked from the inside. Windows shuttered. 9 men drunk and isolated in a cabin surrounded by pine forest with turpentine operations all around them." The pieces were coming together. Lazarus knew that timing would be everything. The first Friday of February was too soon. He needed more preparation. March was possible, but the rains came heavy in March, which might interfere with his plan. April was too late. By April, something might change. Someone might be transferred. The pattern might be broken. February would have to work. He would need just under a month to prepare. His plan required 3 key elements: access to concentrated turpentine, a delivery method, and an alibi that would place him far from Farrow's cabin when the fire occurred. For the turpentine, Lazarus had an advantage. As a premier hand, he was trusted with some of the operation's more technical tasks, including the distillation process that separated crude gum turpentine into spirits of turpentine and rosin. The spirits, pure, highly volatile turpentine, were normally stored in sealed barrels under careful supervision. But Lazarus was sometimes tasked with transferring small amounts into containers for various uses around the operation. Over the course of 3 weeks, he began transferring slightly less than required, hiding the excess in small jars that he buried at various locations in the forest. A few ounces here, a few ounces there, never enough to be noticed, but accumulating steadily toward the gallon he estimated he would need. The delivery method was more complex. He couldn't simply pour turpentine around the cabin and light it. That would be immediately recognized as arson. The fire needed to appear accidental, the kind of tragedy that occurred periodically in turpentine operations where flammable materials were constantly present. He needed the fire to start from within the cabin, to catch the 9 men by surprise, to spread faster than they could react. This is where Lazarus's forbidden literacy became crucial. In a discarded newspaper, he had once read about a technique used by Confederate saboteurs during the early days of tensions between North and South, delayed ignition devices using various chemical combinations. The article had been vague, meant more to alarm readers about enemy tactics than to provide instructions, but it mentioned something about phosphorus and sulfur mixtures that could be triggered by air exposure. Lazarus didn't have access to phosphorus, but he knew that matches, relatively new technology in 1856, contained white phosphorus in their heads. And he knew that certain chemical reactions could generate heat slowly over time. What if he could create a delayed ignition by carefully controlling how air reached flammable materials? He experimented in secret, using tiny quantities of materials, hiding his tests in remote corners of the forest where no one ventured. He discovered that turpentine-soaked rags, if sealed in a container with a slow air leak, would eventually reach a temperature where spontaneous combustion could occur, especially if combined with certain chemical accelerants he could extract from the work materials around him. Linseed oil from the barrel treatments, sulfur from matches, even certain types of tree sap that contained volatile compounds. The timing was impossible to predict precisely, but he found he could create conditions where ignition would occur anywhere from 3 to 8 hours after the materials were set. It wasn't perfect, but it might be enough if he could position the materials correctly and ensure the supervisors stayed in the cabin long enough. For his alibi, Lazarus needed to be visible and accounted for, far from Pharaoh's cabin at the time of the fire. He volunteered for a task he normally avoided, night watch at one of the collection points, a duty that required a worker to stay awake through the night, guarding barrels of processed turpentine from thieves or animals. The collection point he volunteered for was 3 miles east of Pharaoh's cabin, and the overseer in charge was known to check on the night watchman multiple times to ensure he wasn't sleeping. It would be a perfect alibi, but there remained one enormous problem: how to get his incendiary materials into Pharaoh's cabin without being seen, and how to position them where they would be most effective. The solution came from an unexpected source: Silas, the older enslaved man who served the supervisors. In late January, Silas mentioned casually that Pharaoh had asked him to bring extra firewood to the cabin before the February meeting. "Says they want a good fire going, keep the chill off while they play cards," Silas explained. "Wants a whole cord of wood stacked inside the cabin ready to feed the fire all night." Lazarus felt his pulse quicken. Firewood, stacked inside the cabin. No one would question firewood in a cabin during winter. "That's a lot of work for one man," Lazarus said carefully. "You want help carrying it?" Silas looked relieved. "Would you? My back ain't what it used to be, and Pharaoh wants it done the day before the meeting, wants it all stacked neat by his fireplace." So it was arranged. On Thursday, February 5th, 1856, Lazarus and Silas would deliver firewood to Pharaoh's cabin. They would have legitimate access, legitimate reason to be inside, and an opportunity to position the materials exactly where Lazarus needed them. The day before the wood delivery, Lazarus retrieved his hidden jars of turpentine and carefully prepared his ignition device. Using a small clay pot, he had shaped himself and fired in one of the operation's kilns, claiming he was making a cooking vessel. He created a sealed container with a tiny hole in the lid, barely visible. Inside, he placed rags soaked in turpentine and linseed oil, combined with sulfur extracted from match heads and certain reactive tree resins he had identified through his experiments. The mixture was designed to slowly heat as air gradually entered through the small hole, reaching ignition temperature several hours after being sealed. He prepared 3 such pots, hedging his bets. If one failed, perhaps another would succeed. Each pot was small enough to hide among firewood, and he disguised them by coating the outside with ash and dirt so they looked like nothing more than old, forgotten containers. On Thursday afternoon, Lazarus and Silas loaded a wagon with split firewood and drove it to Pharaoh's cabin. The supervisor was there, watching impatiently as they unloaded the wood and stacked it beside the large stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the cabin. The cabin was roughly built but spacious, with a heavy wooden table in the center where the supervisors would play cards, a few chairs scattered around, and shelves holding bottles of whiskey and other supplies. "Stack it neat," Pharaoh barked. "I don't want no mess tomorrow night. This is an important meeting." As they worked, Lazarus carefully positioned his 3 clay pots among the firewood. One went near the bottom of the stack, wedged between 2 logs close to the fireplace. Another he placed behind the stack, pressed against the wall where it wouldn't be visible. The third he tucked into a gap in the stack about 3 feet off the ground, positioned so it would be surrounded by wood on all sides once the stack was complete. The placement was crucial. The pots near the bottom would ignite first as they heated, but the fire might initially be small and controllable. The pot higher in the stack would ignite later when the fire was already established, creating a second wave of intense heat. And all of them were positioned to create an inferno that would spread rapidly through the dry wood, the wooden floor, the wooden walls, everything in the cabin that could burn. But Lazarus had one more element to add. In his experimentation, he had discovered that turpentine vapor, being heavier than air, would settle in low places if released in an enclosed space. If he could ensure vapor accumulation before ignition, the resulting explosion would be catastrophic. As they finished stacking the wood, Lazarus pretended to stumble, dropping several logs. In the confusion of picking them up, he used a small knife to puncture 2 of the sealed turpentine containers he had hidden among the firewood. The liquid began to slowly seep out, soaking into the wood around it, beginning to evaporate and settle toward the floor. The smell was there, but faint, and in a cabin where turpentine-related materials were often stored, it wouldn't raise suspicion. "You clumsy fool," Pharaoh snapped. "Get that wood stacked right and get out." They finished quickly and left. As they drove the wagon away, Silas remarked, "You seem nervous. Something wrong?" "Just tired," Lazarus replied. "This work wears a man down." That night, Lazarus barely slept. His mind ran through every step of the plan, every possible failure point. What if the pots didn't ignite? What if they ignited too soon, before the supervisors arrived? What if someone discovered them before the meeting? What if the fire started but the men escaped? But by morning, it was too late to change anything. The mechanism was set in motion. Friday, February 6, 1856, dawned cold and clear. Lazarus reported for his regular work, tapping trees in his assigned section of the forest. He worked mechanically, his mind elsewhere, counting down the hours until evening. At 4 o'clock, he reported to the overseer to begin his night watch duty at the collection point 3 miles east of Pharaoh's cabin. The overseer, a man named Duncan, walked him to the collection point personally, showed him where to sit, where to keep the lantern, and reminded him that he would be checking throughout the night. "I catch you sleeping, you'll get the lash," Duncan warned. "This turpentine's valuable, can't have it stolen or spilled." "Yes, sir," Lazarus replied. "I'll keep good watch." As the sun set and darkness settled over the pine forest, Lazarus sat beside his lantern, ostensibly watching over barrels of turpentine, but actually calculating times and distances in his head. Pharaoh's cabin was 3 miles west. The supervisors usually arrived around sundown, which was happening now. They would drink, play cards, conduct their business. Based on his observations and what Silas had told him, they typically settled in for serious drinking around 2 or 3 hours after arrival. His clay pots, if his calculations were correct, would reach ignition temperature sometime between 8 and midnight. A wide window, but one that should coincide with the supervisors being drunk, comfortable, and trapped inside the locked cabin. At 8 o'clock, Duncan made his first check, appearing out of the darkness to ensure Lazarus was awake and alert. "All quiet?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Nothing but crickets and owls." Duncan grunted approval and disappeared back into the forest. At 9:30, Lazarus thought he smelled smoke on the wind, but he couldn't be sure. The night breeze was unpredictable, and there were always fires burning somewhere in the turpentine operation. Workers' cabins, processing facilities, controlled burns. He remained seated, outwardly calm, inwardly coiled tight as a spring. At 10:15, Duncan returned for his second check. This time, he seemed agitated. "You smell smoke?" he asked. "Maybe a little," Lazarus replied carefully. "Thought it was just somebody's cook fire." "That's coming from the west," Duncan said, sniffing the air. "That's a lot of smoke for a cook fire." He paused, uncertain. "You stay here. Don't move. I'm going to check what that is." Duncan disappeared into the darkness, moving west toward the source of the smoke. Lazarus remained exactly where he was, his heart hammering. He forced himself to stay calm, to give no sign of the chaos he knew must be unfolding 3 miles away. 20 minutes later, he saw the orange glow through the trees to the west. Not the small flickering of a campfire or lantern, but a roaring conflagration that lit up the night sky, casting dancing shadows through the forest. Other workers began to appear, drawn by the light and commotion. Someone was shouting in the distance, voices raised in alarm. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Cumberland County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. An hour later, Duncan returned with 3 other men, all of them covered in soot and reeking of smoke. Their faces were grim, shocked. "Pack up," Duncan told Lazarus. "Night watch is over. There's been a terrible accident." "What happened?" Lazarus asked, allowing just the right amount of concern into his voice. "Pharaoh's cabin," Duncan said, his voice hollow. "Burned to the ground. The supervisors were inside, all 9 of them. He couldn't finish the sentence. Lazarus felt a cold satisfaction settle over him, but he kept his expression neutral, shocked. "All 9, he repeated. "How?" "Don't know yet. Fire must have started from the fireplace, spread too fast. Door was locked from inside, windows shuttered. By the time anyone saw the flames, it was too late. Too late for any of them." As they walked back toward the main compound, Lazarus could see the glow still burning in the distance. The fire had consumed everything with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural, though Lazarus knew exactly how natural, how carefully planned every element had been. He had accounted for the dry winter wood, the enclosed space, the vapor accumulation, the multiple ignition points. He had created the perfect conditions for an inferno that would give 9 men no chance of escape. As news of the tragedy spread through the workers' quarters, Lazarus listened to the shocked whispers, the speculation, the horror. No one suspected him. Why would they? He had been 3 miles away, under direct supervision, with witnesses who could confirm his presence throughout the evening. He was simply another enslaved worker, shocked by the terrible accident that had claimed the lives of 9 white men. But as he lay on his bunk that night, listening to the distant shouts of men still fighting the fire's remnants, Lazarus felt no triumph. The fire had taken 9 lives, had avenged Dinah and their son, had punished the men who had made theft and cruelty into a system. But it hadn't brought his wife back. It hadn't restored what had been stolen from him. It had simply balanced a ledger written in blood and ash. He closed his eyes and saw Dinah's face, remembered her laugh, felt the ghost of her hand in his. And for the first time since learning of her fate, he wept. Not tears of grief alone, but tears of release, of a burden finally set down, of a debt finally paid. The investigation into the fire began at dawn. Vernon Ketchum arrived with the plantation owners, including Cyrus Hartwell and several officials from Fayetteville. The scene was one of total devastation. Pharaoh's cabin had been reduced to a smoking foundation of charred wood and stone. The 9 bodies, or what remained of them, were barely identifiable as human. The heat had been so intense that the very bones had partially calcined, turning to ash and fragments. The initial conclusion was swift and certain: tragic accident. The fire had clearly started near or in the fireplace, possibly from a spark igniting the stack of firewood that Silas and Lazarus had delivered the day before. The door had been locked from the inside, the windows shuttered against the cold, creating a death trap once the flames began. The men had been drinking. Empty whiskey bottles were found among the ruins, which explained why they hadn't reacted quickly enough to save themselves. "Terrible thing," Hartwell said, standing beside the ruins. 9 good men, all at once. This'll set the operation back months. But Vernon Ketchum was not entirely satisfied with the simple explanation. He was a careful man, one who had built his business on attention to detail, and something about the scene troubled him. The fire had burned too hot, too fast. Even accounting for the firewood and the wooden structure, the intensity suggested accelerants, and in a turpentine operation, accelerants were always present. But why would there be concentrated turpentine in a supervisor's cabin? He walked the perimeter of the ruins, noting the pattern of the burn. The most intense heat seemed to have been centered in 3 locations. Near the fireplace, yes, but also along the western wall and in the middle of the room. 3 distinct points of maximum combustion. That was unusual for a fire that had supposedly spread from a single source. "Silas," Ketchum called to the old man who had helped deliver the firewood. "You brought wood here yesterday?" "Yes, sir. Me and Lazarus, we stacked it all neat like Mr. Farrow wanted." "Was there anything else in that wood? Any containers? Any materials?" Silas shook his head. "Just wood, sir. Split pine, good and dry." Ketchum turned to Lazarus, who stood among the gathered workers, his face appropriately somber. "You helped with the wood?" "Yes, sir." "Did you notice anything unusual? Anything in the cabin that seemed out of place?" Lazarus met Ketchum's eyes directly, his expression open and honest. "No, sir. Just the cabin like always. Mr. Farrow, he watched us the whole time, made sure we stacked the wood neat. We did what we were told and left." Ketchum studied him for a long moment. There was something in the man's eyes, a depth, an intelligence that seemed at odds with his station. But his alibi was airtight. Duncan had confirmed that Lazarus had been at the collection point, under supervision, at the time of the fire. He couldn't possibly have been involved. "All right," Ketchum said finally. "Back to work, all of you. We've got quotas to meet, tragedy or not." But Ketchum's suspicions, though he didn't act on them immediately, led him to conduct a more thorough examination of the supervisor's affairs. What he discovered shocked him to his core. In the ruins of Farrow's cabin, protected by chance in a metal box that had survived the fire, was the ledger. The lock had melted, but the book inside was largely intact, its pages charred at the edges but still readable. Ketchum opened it and found 7 years of detailed records documenting systematic theft from the very plantation owners he served. The discovery put Ketchum in an impossible position. If he revealed the ledger, the plantation owners would know they had been robbed for years under his supervision. They would blame him for failing to detect the scheme, possibly suspect him of being part of it. His reputation would be destroyed, and he might face legal consequences. But if he concealed the ledger, destroyed it, he would be protecting the memory of 9 thieves and perpetuating a lie. He made his decision quickly. The ledger disappeared, destroyed in a fire in his own office a week later, an accident, he claimed, caused by an overturned lantern. The plantation owners never learned the full extent of the theft. Some discrepancies in production records were eventually noticed, but these were attributed to the poor bookkeeping of the deceased supervisors and written off as unfortunate but unrecoverable losses. The official story became fixed. 9 supervisors had died in a tragic accidental fire, a terrible reminder of the dangers inherent in the turpentine industry. They were buried in a mass grave in the local cemetery, their names recorded on a simple stone marker. At the funeral, attended by the plantation owners and other white citizens of the county, they were eulogized as hard-working men taken too soon by fate. Not a single enslaved person attended the funeral. And if any of them suspected the truth about that fire, they kept their suspicions to themselves. In the weeks following the fire, the turpentine operation underwent significant changes. New supervisors were brought in, men from other counties who had no connection to the previous regime. These new men were, if anything, more closely monitored by the plantation owners, who had become nervous about oversight in the wake of the tragedy. The system of isolated forest camps continued, but with more frequent inspections, more direct accountability. For Lazarus, life returned to a routine that was simultaneously familiar and forever altered. He worked his assigned trees, met his quotas, and gave no one any reason to notice him. But those who knew him well saw changes. He was quieter than before, more withdrawn. The spark that Dinah had kindled in him, that brief period of hope and connection, had been extinguished along with 9 lives in a burning cabin. 3 months after the fire, in May of 1856, Lazarus received unexpected news. Cyrus Hartwell, his legal owner, had decided to sell him. Not south, as he had once feared, but to a plantation owner in eastern North Carolina who needed experienced turpentine workers. The sale was routine, unremarkable, just another transaction in the endless buying and selling of human beings that characterized the era. But before Lazarus left Cumberland County, an old woman named Hattie, the same woman who had first told him about Dinah's assault, pulled him aside. She was one of the few people who seemed to understand what had really happened that February night, though she never spoke of it directly. "I heard something," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "Heard that Dinah, she's working on a plantation near Charleston, belonged to a man named Rutledge, grows rice in the low country. Don't know if it's true, but that's what I heard." Lazarus absorbed this information without expression, but inside, something shifted. Dinah was alive. She was far away, in South Carolina, working in the deadly rice fields where malaria and exhaustion killed workers by the dozens. But she was alive, and now he knew where to find her. "Thank you," he said simply. Hattie nodded. "Don't know what happened in that fire," she said carefully. "Don't want to know. But whatever debts you settled, I hope they gave you some peace." "Peace isn't what I found," Lazarus replied. "But maybe it's what I paid for." The sale went through, and Lazarus was transported to his new location, a plantation near the town of Kinston. His new owner, a man named Peterson, was neither particularly cruel nor kind. He was simply a businessman who saw enslaved workers as investments to be managed efficiently. The work was similar to what Lazarus had done in Cumberland County, tapping pines and collecting resin, but the atmosphere was different. The supervisors here were watched more closely, their authority checked by regular oversight. Lazarus worked at the Peterson plantation for 2 years, saving every scrap of information he could gather about the route south, about the plantation near Charleston where Dinah might be, about the possibility, however remote, of somehow reaching her. He knew it was likely impossible. The distance was enormous, the obstacles insurmountable. But the knowledge that she lived, that she was somewhere in the world, gave him something to hold on to in the darkest hours. In the fall of 1858, rumors began to circulate among the enslaved workers about tensions between North and South, about political crises over slavery's expansion, about the possibility of war. These rumors meant little to Lazarus at first. The concerns of politicians seemed impossibly distant from the daily reality of survival in the turpentine forests. But older workers spoke of wars as times of chaos, when the normal order broke down, when impossible things sometimes became possible. Then, in October of 1858, something extraordinary happened. A man appeared at the Peterson plantation claiming to be a slave trader, with documents authorizing him to purchase several workers for a buyer in South Carolina. Among the workers he sought to purchase was Lazarus. The price offered was generous, $120, more than Lazarus's probable market value. Peterson, always attentive to profit, agreed to the sale. Within 2 days, Lazarus found himself shackled in a wagon heading south, along with 3 other workers who had also been purchased. The trader was a rough-looking man who said little, driving the wagon with efficient determination. They traveled for 3 days, stopping at roadside camps at night. On the third night, as they made camp in a dense forest somewhere in the border region between North Carolina and South Carolina, the trader did something unexpected. He unlocked Lazarus's shackles. "You can run if you want," the trader said quietly. "Or you can listen to what I have to say." Lazarus, wary but curious, stayed seated. "Who are you?" "Name's not important. What's important is that an old woman named Hattie, back in Cumberland County, she got word to certain people that you needed to get south. Needed to find someone near Charleston. That's going to cost you, though. You owe a debt now to the people who arranged this." Lazarus felt his heart hammering. "What kind of debt?" "The kind you pay forward. There's a network. People helping people find their families, helping folks get where they need to go. You find who you're looking for, you help the next person. That's how it works. That's how it has to work." The trader pulled out a piece of paper with an address written on it. "Rutledge Plantation outside Charleston. That's where she is, far as anyone knows. These other 3 I bought. They're going to be sold proper in Columbia. I got to make this look legitimate. But you're getting off this wagon come morning. There's folks who'll help you get closer to Charleston, but the last part, getting onto that plantation, finding her, that's on you. And if you're caught, you never heard of me, never heard of this network, understand?" Lazarus took the paper, his hands trembling slightly. Why? Why would anyone do this? The trader's expression was hard to read in the firelight. "Because Hattie said you paid a debt already, paid it in full. Said you settled accounts for a lot of people, even if they don't know it. Said you earned this chance." He paused. "Don't waste it." The next morning, the wagon stopped at a crossroads. The trader nodded toward a narrow path leading east. "Follow that path 3 miles, you'll come to a farm. Ask for a woman named Grace. Tell her you're the one from Cumberland County. She'll know what to do." Lazarus climbed down from the wagon, free of shackles for the first time in years. He looked back at the trader once, meeting his eyes in silent acknowledgement, then turned and walked down the path into an uncertain future. The network that helped Lazarus was part of a larger, loosely organized system that had existed in the shadows of the South for decades. Free black people, sympathetic whites, and enslaved people themselves, all working together to reunite families torn apart by slavery's brutal economics. It operated on principles of mutual aid and secrecy, each person knowing only their small part of the larger whole, each link in the chain protecting the others through deliberate ignorance of the full network. Grace, the woman at the farm, was a free black woman who had purchased her own freedom 20 years earlier, and now used her legitimate business, selling produce to plantation kitchens, as cover for helping people navigate the dangerous geography of the enslaved South. She hid Lazarus for 3 days while arrangements were made, then sent him on to the next link in the chain, a white farmer who opposed slavery on religious grounds. From there, Lazarus moved through a series of way stations, each bringing him closer to Charleston. The journey took nearly a month of hiding in barns and root cellars, of traveling by night, of assuming different identities and stories. He posed as a worker being transferred between plantations, as a slave hired out for temporary labor, as whatever the situation required. The network provided him with forged documents when needed, with clothes that fit his cover stories, with detailed information about safe routes and dangerous areas. Finally, in early December of 1858, Lazarus reached the outskirts of Charleston. The Rutledge Plantation was 10 miles outside the city, a rice plantation that sprawled across thousands of acres of low-country marshland. Getting onto the plantation, finding Dinah among possibly hundreds of enslaved workers, and doing so without raising suspicion would require careful planning. Lazarus spent a week observing the plantation from a distance, learning its rhythms, identifying possible approaches. He learned that the plantation employed hired workers during harvest season, bringing in additional labor from surrounding areas. He managed to attach himself to a group of such workers, presenting himself as a hand sent from a neighboring plantation to help with the late harvest. On his third day working in the rice fields, bent over in knee-deep water cutting rice stalks, he saw her. Dinah was walking along the edge of the field, carrying a water bucket to the workers. She was thinner than he remembered, her face harder, marked by the years of grief and labor. But it was unmistakably her, alive, moving through the world, existing in the same moment as he did. Their eyes met across 50 feet of rice paddy. Her bucket slipped from her hands, water spilling across the muddy ground. For a frozen instant, neither moved, both locked in a moment of recognition so profound it seemed to stop time itself. Then Dinah took a step toward him, and another, moving faster until she was running, splashing through the shallow water, not caring who saw, not caring about the consequences. Lazarus met her halfway, and when they came together, when his arms closed around her after 3 years of separation, the weight of everything he had done, everything he had endured, everything he had paid to reach this moment, finally made sense. They held each other in the middle of a rice field, two people who had been torn apart by a system designed to deny their humanity, now reunited through a combination of planning, luck, and the hidden networks of resistance that slavery's brutality had ironically created. Around them, other workers had stopped to watch, some smiling, some crying, all of them recognizing the miracle of two people finding each other across the vast, cruel distances of the enslaved South. "You found me," Dinah whispered against his chest. "How did you find me?" "I never stopped looking," Lazarus replied. "I never stopped." But their reunion was shadowed by the reality of their situation. Lazarus was there illegally, under false pretenses. He couldn't stay. They had perhaps days, maybe only hours, before his presence would raise questions, before someone would check his documentation more carefully, before the lie would collapse. That night, meeting in secret in the slave quarters, they talked in whispers about what to do. Lazarus told her about the network that had helped him, about the possibility of escape, of reaching free territory in the north. But Dinah shook her head. "I can't," she said. "Running, that's for the young, the strong. I'm neither anymore. And if I'm caught, if we're caught together, they'll kill us both. You know they will. Then I'll stay here," Lazarus said. "I'll find a way to be sold here, to work here with you. And live your whole life in rice fields that'll kill you in 5 years? You've already paid too much, Lazarus. Don't pay more." They argued through the night, each trying to convince the other to choose survival over reunion. But by dawn, they had reached an understanding. They would have what time they could steal, these few precious days, and then Lazarus would go north, would seek freedom, would live the life that Dinah's sacrifice would make possible. "You live free," she told him, her hand on his face. "You live free, and that means I'm free too, somewhere, somehow. You understand? Your freedom is mine. That's how this has to be." Lazarus spent 5 more days on the Rutledge plantation, 5 days of stolen moments, of conversations that compressed years of loss and longing into fragments of time. He told Dinah about the fire, about the 9 men, about the debt he had paid for what they had done to her and their child. He expected her to be shocked, horrified, but instead she simply nodded, as if she had always known, as if the knowledge of his revenge had been written in the ash and smoke that had reached across hundreds of miles. "They deserved it," she said simply, "and more." On the 6th day, before dawn, Lazarus left the plantation. Dinah walked with him to the edge of the rice fields, to the point where the cultivated land gave way to wild marsh. They held each other one last time, and then Lazarus turned north toward freedom, toward a future that would be forever marked by what he had lost and what he had done to avenge it. He never saw Dinah again. The historical record of what happened to Lazarus after December 1858 is fragmentary and uncertain. There are hints, suggestions, possibilities, but no definitive answers. Some accounts place a man matching his description in Pennsylvania in 1859, working in a lumber camp under a different name. Others suggest he made it to Canada, settling in a community of formerly enslaved people near Toronto. Still others claim he died attempting to cross into free territory, his body never recovered, his final fate unknown. What is certain is that 9 men died in Cumberland County, North Carolina, on February 6, 1856, in a fire that was officially ruled accidental. What is certain is that their deaths ended a scheme of systematic theft and cruelty that had operated for years under the cover of legitimate business. What is certain is that the deaths were so perfectly executed, so apparently accidental, that no one was ever charged. No investigation ever pointed to murder. The fire became a footnote in the history of North Carolina's turpentine industry, a tragic reminder of the dangers inherent in working with flammable materials. The 9 supervisors were largely forgotten, their names preserved only on a weathered stone marker in a cemetery that few people visit anymore. But among the descendants of enslaved people who worked in those pine forests, the story of Lazarus and the fire that killed 9 men persisted as oral history, passed down through generations. In these tellings, the story became a parable about justice that the legal system would never provide, about debts that could only be paid in fire and ash, about the lengths to which love and grief could drive a person who had nothing left to lose. The truth of what happened, the precise mechanics of how Lazarus planned and executed his revenge, if indeed it was his revenge, died with him. But the fire itself remains a historical fact, documented in county records, in the ledgers of plantation operations, in the death certificates of 9 men who all died on the same night, in the same place, in circumstances that were just plausible enough to be accepted as accident. Vernon Ketchum never spoke publicly about his suspicions regarding the fire, and the ledger he destroyed took its secrets to the grave. The plantation owners who had been robbed never learned the full extent of the theft, and the system that had enabled it, isolated camps, unchecked authority, human beings treated as property, continued until the Civil War finally destroyed the economic foundation on which it all rested. In the decades after the war, when formerly enslaved people began to tell their stories more openly, an old woman in Charleston was interviewed by a northern journalist writing about slavery's aftermath. Her name was Dinah, and she spoke about her life before freedom, about the hardships of the rice plantations, about the husband she had lost to the turpentine forests of North Carolina. The journalist asked if she ever learned what became of her husband, this man named Lazarus. "I believe he found his freedom," she said carefully. "One way or another, I believe he found what he was looking for, and that's enough for me to know." When pressed about the specifics, about whether her husband had escaped north or met some other fate, she smiled slightly and changed the subject. Some stories, her expression seemed to say, were not meant to be told in full, not meant to be written down in newspapers or preserved in archives. Some stories were meant to live in whispers, in the spaces between official history, in the memories of people who understood that justice and law were not always the same thing. The pine forests of Cumberland County still stand, though the turpentine industry that once defined the region has long since faded into history. If you walk through those woods today, you can still see the scars on ancient trees, the box cuts that were made over a century and a half ago, now healed over, but still visible as dark marks on weathered bark. And if you know where to look, you can find the foundation stones of Pharaoh's cabin, hidden beneath decades of forest growth, marking the spot where 9 men died in a fire that changed nothing and everything. This mystery shows us that the most carefully hidden truths often leave the faintest traces. A ledger destroyed, a name whispered across generations, a love that survived separation and loss to forge a path through impossible distances. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Do you think Lazarus truly found freedom? Or did his revenge cost him more than he could bear? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries buried in the shadows of American history. The past keeps its secrets well, but sometimes, if we listen carefully enough, we can hear the echoes of truth in the silence. See you in the next video.